Hello and welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast. I'm Morag. Join me each week in conversation with leading ecological thinkers, activists, authors, designers and practitioners to explore what now? What is the kind of thinking we need to navigate a positive and regenerative way forward? To myceliate possibilities to explore what a thriving one planet way of life could look like. My guests offer voices of clarity and common sense. I'm so delighted to be welcoming my friend and true permaculture legend to this episode, a grandmother of permaculture, Robyn Francis. Robyn is a permaculture pioneer and leading international permaculture educator who has worked in permaculture since 1983 around the world. She's initiated so many permaculture projects and programs and worked closely with Bill Mollison. Robyn was a founding director of Permaculture International Limited and the Permaculture International magazine, and 30 years ago she created Djanbung Gardens, home of Permaculture College Australia, a permaculture training centre and demo farm in Nembin. She was also central to creating the accredited permaculture training, designed Jarlanbah Ecovillage, and when I was just starting out as a permaculture designer and educator, I attended a number of her permaculture extension workshops at her place. Together we explore her story of permaculture and her insights, reflections and hopes for permaculture into the future. The Sense Making in a Changing World podcast is a project of the Permaculture Education Institute. We teach permaculture design, teaching and livelihood skills online to people on 6 continents, who in turn localise and enrich it and find appropriate ways to apply the planet care ethics of earth care, people care and fair share wherever they are. I'm recording this episode from my hand-built solar-powered studio here on beautiful Gubbi Gubbi country, surrounded by my permaculture design gardens in a permaculture village. Before we jump in, I'd love to invite you to subscribe to the Sense Making a Changing World podcast on your favourite podcast app, and please do leave us a 5-star review and a lovely comment. It does indeed help the bots to find our show. Okay, well, let's now turn to the conversation with Robyn Francis. Thank you so much for joining me on the show, Robyn. I've been wanting to invite you for a long time, so I'm glad we finally get a chance to sit down and have a yarn, because you are, in my mind, one of the pioneers of the permaculture movement. You've been involved in it since when I was still in high school somewhere, middle of high school. And so whenever I saw permaculture, you were there as a key person driving that, and such an innovator in this space. I mean, from permaculture demonstration centers, permaculture videos, permaculture media, permaculture, like if you talk about permaculture, there you've been right at the heart, lifting on permaculture education, all the advanced courses. So it's an absolute delight to welcome to the show and to talk about the she story of permaculture.
Yeah, the her story, huh?
The her story. Yes, that's right. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you first, Robyn, what drew you in the first instance to permaculture? Did you get drawn into it, or did it come tapping you on the shoulder? How did permaculture in your life find a way to be together?
Oh, look, it was a natural progression. And my parents were very self-reliant people. They both grew up on dairy farms through the Depression, and most of my childhood was in Inverell. We had a 1/4 acre block, and we had veggies and fruit trees and ducks and chickens and a couple of hives of bees and a milking goat that we tethered out to mow the neighbours' lawns. And I just thought, that side of things was normal. When I left home and sort of went out into the world, I missed out on being able to study what I wanted. I went through 27 jobs in 2.5 years in Sydney, discovered a lot of things I didn't want to do, but saved up and went travelling. But I was also part of the counterculture movement, and so everybody was talking about sort of, back to the land and, living a simple life close to nature and all that stuff. Traveling really opened my eyes, being in different cultures, and especially what grabbed me was the village culture and the different ways people grew their food and all the different amazing cuisines in Southeast Asia. And then I was traveling with a German boyfriend. We went to Europe and lived in Bavaria for 3.5 years, and I worked and learnt the local dialect. And it was amazing being in a whole new environment. So this was in the sort of early mid 70s. My first spring, seeing all these flowers, this riot of wildflowers, and so many of them look familiar. And then one day I was looking at one of them, I says, I'm sure you are chamomile. And then it hit me, all these wonderful herbs in my herb books. This is where they live. This is where they're from. This is where they grow in the wild. And I spent a lot of my time exploring forest and field and collecting medicinal herbs and wild foods and getting to know the edible mushrooms and noticing how certain things sort of grew in certain environments and in association with each other. And also fortunate in that it was the last of the old generation farmers there, and getting to see the traditional, sustainable European agriculture, which is so different to what I was familiar with in Australia, where the only thing they imported onto the farm was the diesel to put in their tractor, but they were still doing their rotational crops and, use their animal manures for fertilizer. And, their farmers' wives didn't go to the supermarket. They still made their own sauerkraut and had all their traditional storage systems for their food to get through the winter. And after 3 German winters, I had enough and says, okay, I need the sun. I'm a solar animal. And we came back to Australia to get some land. And my vision was to set up a farm as like a botanical gardens of useful plants that are put together in a similar way to how you see them in nature. My Inverell High School education never introduced me to the term or concepts of ecology, but I was getting to know it just by observing it and seeing it. We spent, a year traveling back to Australia, traveling again through many countries and climates, sort of Turkey, Afghanistan before the Taliban, Iran before the Ayatollah, throughout India, Sri Lanka, and just everywhere I went, I was just fascinating seeing the traditional farming and food systems. And this was all sort of, building up my dream. And there was one really pivotal moment in Kerala in South India. A young student took us to see his village on the weekend. His grandmother was a Brahmin farmer, but he had befriended some of the untouchables that worked for her. And he took us around the back of the village and to meet his untouchable friend. And it was this little tiny hut, just made with palm leaves and bamboo. And it had about a 1.5 meter wide yard around it. And it was just chock-a-block full of food. Chock-a-block full of food. And I went, wow, how can anybody be hungry when you can grow so much food in a small space? Anyway, I arrived back in Australia in 1977. And there was an organic festival just out of Sydney. One of the speakers there was Bill Mollison, promoting the soon-to-be-published Permaculture 1. It was just really fascinating listening to Bill. It just pulled everything I was thinking and dreaming of together, also integrating so many more things that I was also fascinated in, like natural building and energy efficient design and appropriate technology and yada, yada. Yeah, I couldn't wait to get the book, and I subscribed to the journal. And so, it was sort of like a natural progression. My husband and I got a property on the mid-north coast where I set up a herb farm. I was there for 6 years. And then, the relationship sort of, wasn't going too well. So we separated, and I did a PDC in 1983. It was the first women's PDC held up in the Tweed. But a couple of my neighbours down at Rollins Plains had done some of Bill's early courses, and seeing how they turned their place around, sort of by actually applying the design methodology. One of them was Hans Erken. And it was actually Hans that really encouraged me to go and do the course because, I sort of had fantasized about, wouldn't it be great to do a permaculture course and help people and design their properties? And so that's how it all started.
It's interesting, isn't it? Like there are so many, like what you're saying, all the journeys that you've been on and exploring the traditional practices, things that have been forever. It's such a short period of time that we've not been doing things this way. And I think what you put your finger on there is that permaculture kind of gives language or a way of speaking about all of those different traditions. For me, it also felt that way. It was almost like a coming home. It's like, this is a space where I can bring all of that into, and it's a language that makes it somehow accessible. And I wonder too whether just that the structure of permaculture or the language of permaculture or the ethics, or what is it about it that makes it easier for us to grasp what all of that is about, that sense, that feeling that we get when we go to all those places, that we can grasp it.
Well, I suppose, what underpins all Indigenous and sustainable traditional cultures are sort of basic principles. And it's one of the things I've found again and again when I've been teaching in those situations with traditional societies, with Indigenous peoples. The most common feedback I have is, look, thank you. Now I have an understanding of how it works, why it works. The big course I taught in Bali in 99, one of the participants there, he said, I always felt ashamed of my father being a poor farmer and sticking with the old ways and not being progressive and getting the new varieties of rice and the chemicals. He says, now I am proud of him.
Yeah.
And I am proud to be Balinese. Now I understand my culture. I understand why those traditional systems work. I understand the science of why they work. And now I can't wait to go home and work with my father and revive some of the good things that have been lost.
Yeah. It's so powerful in that way, isn't it? And the modernization and that psychological impact that's been had on so many cultures, that the backward and primitive way, I think permaculture has been something that's been a huge gift in that, in many different places. And what I love too about permaculture is the way that it can be localized and contextualized. It's not just, okay, this is exactly how to do it, recipe plonk. It is at that ethics principles level, and then it just keeps morphing and changing into wherever it lands. And I wonder if you could maybe share some examples of how you've seen that happen.
The important thing is the principles, and having that basic, I suppose, ecological understanding and insight and a little bit of that interdisciplinary insight. I think it's pretty powerful. So back to Bali, I was being shown around some of the farms in one of the more traditional areas up in the mountains around Papuan. The water came from the big subak, from the big irrigation canal into the paddies, into the sawa. It went through a deeper pond that had maybe a square meter, that had water hyacinths growing in it. And that's where they had their little shrine for the rice goddess. And they said, look, we always make sure the water goes through here with this plant. The rice goddess loves this plant and its flowers, and it makes the water really good for the rice. And I says, did you know that this plant is a powerful water purifier? It's taking up, sort of contaminants and stuff that might be in the water. So it is definitely, giving your rice very good quality water. And just, wow, to have that insight and understanding of what the biology and the ecology is behind these practices, then they don't get lost.
No, that's right.
There's just so many examples like that.
Yeah. You've also been the founder of many different demonstration places of permaculture, one where you're sitting right now. And you also created some places in Sydney as well. What do you feel as being the key importance of focusing on setting up places where people can come and see and be in taste and touch and feel? As that seems to be a core focus of what you've done, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I suppose I've always wanted to walk my talk. Talk's easy, but you've got to walk it. And after I did my PDC, I moved down to Sydney, and I tried to, sort of talk to people about permaculture, and they go, oh, well, it's too polluting here. I'm only renting, or oh, that's what I'll do when I move to the country and I've got lots of acres. And so I realized, well, it's pointless doing anything until I dispel the myths.
Yeah.
I found a place to rent with a little backyard, 6 by 8 meters, and it was in an appalling state. Even the cooch and onion weed was struggling to grow. I think the previous tenant had just 5 dogs living in there or something. And within 3 months, I was harvesting a good 40-50% of my food from that little backyard. I just did, sort of full on, no-dig gardens with lots of compost, and then I started teaching. And then people had sort of come up with all their reasons why you couldn't do it in the city. And I go, oh, but look. And that was how I started with that. And everywhere I've been, I've helped and encouraged people to get, demonstrations going. And co-taught the first PDC in India with Bill in 1987 in the Deccan Plateau. And Dr. Venkat, one of the participants, was working with an aid organisation, the Deccan Development Society, DDS. And they had acquired a site to set up a permaculture or some sort of a centre, to show people what could be done and alternatives. And Venkat just transformed that site. And I was back 2.5 years later, and in this area that, gets, maybe 250 millimetres of rain a year if they're lucky, where you've got 1 foot of soil over laterite rock, was just this most abundant, verdant space, in the semi-arid region. And, they were working with about 40 villages, rural villages. Backtracking a little, Bill and I gave an introductory seminar in 86 there after the second International Permaculture Conference. And I showed some pictures of my backyard in Sydney, the one I was just telling you about, before and afters. And Dr. Venkat was in the audience, and he was a retired medical doctor, GP. Mm-hmm. And he really wanted to do something about people's health, but not Band-Aid medicine. And when he saw the pictures that I showed, old slides, with the slide projector, of this little backyard in Sydney, that was a light bulb moment for him. And he went, wow, even landless labourers have got a few square metres where they could grow some food. And one of the biggest problems with nutrition is the lack of fresh fruit and vegetables. Vegetables were seen as a luxury item. You had to take a day off work, get to the market town, buy these vegetables that were overpriced and poor quality. And so when we came back 6 months later to teach the first full course, he'd already set up a demonstration garden in one of those villages. And it was just 3 by 6 meters, and had 18 different varieties of vegetables growing in it. They were just using their wastewater because there was just one well for the whole community. And so, they had to carry their water and just using their wastewater to keep it going. And that was the first vegetables grown in that village in living memory.
Oh, my gosh.
Everybody thought food, you have to grow it on a farm. It sort of kick-started the whole home garden movement, kitchen garden movement in India. But just that first little demonstration, next thing they had, 30 other women from that and neighbouring villages that wanted a garden too.
Yeah, the power of doing it and seeing it. It's extraordinary, isn't it, that power? Yep. The other thing that I think is super powerful about that is the rate of transformation, how you can, like you're saying, in your garden in just a few months, and how, what they did in the Deccan to be able to transform so quickly. And it gives me an enormous amount of hope that looking at the amount of devastation that we have in landscapes now, if we apply these principles, how we can actually get some transformation rapidly.
And I mean, that's the power of our annual vegetable gardens. They're really fast to kickstart. I get sort of quite annoyed with a lot of permies that go, oh, but permaculture is only perennials. No, it's not. Yeah, you plant your perennials, but you could be waiting 5 or 10 years for a fruit tree to produce anything. You're going to starve for all that time. And a lovely way to look at it is sort of like your annual vegetable garden is like the first stage of succession. So you sort of, plant perennials within that. It's so quick and easy to kickstart and get a result and, get food from straight away. And you don't need much space for it.
And like you're saying, it's just the wastewater and the compost and a few seeds, and you have a garden. Yeah.
And irrespective of climate, I was invited to teach a course in Iceland with Albert Bates. And it was interesting. I sort of got there a few days beforehand to just get a feel for the place, and saw a lot of the wild herbs and edibles that I knew from my time in Germany, the temperate plants. I was with the convener as he was going around sort of getting resources and stuff for the course, and he popped into his mum's place. She had the most amazing veggie garden. It was just so lush. I took some photos of it. The course begins and everybody's going, oh, yeah, look, permaculture would work really well in the tropics or in, maybe south of France but, it's too cold here. We can't grow anything without a greenhouse. And so I started to sneak these photos that I'd already taken in Iceland into my presentations and pop it up on the screen. Where do you think this is? Oh, that must be South France. I went, no, it's in Reykjavik. Went, what? I said, look, yeah, you've got a long season of the year where you can't grow things, but you've also got a summer with incredibly long days and gentle sunshine. So things grow really well. And look, how did people survive here before there were supermarkets? Oh, yeah, well, talk to your old grandmothers and great aunts and see what they did. And, and what they grew and their food preservation systems. And it was just such a wake-up moment for them. And it's just, the power of showing that it can be done.
Yeah. Have you got I know you're still sharing all these stories through all the courses that you run, but all these photographs of all these backyards, have you got these all documented somewhere? The depth of visual experience and practical experience, what people have been doing in their backyards. Like as you're saying, what were the traditional practices in Germany? You've taken photographs of all these different places along the way, and there they are in your care, these stories like that. And I think the power of a story is something like you share stories a lot through exactly what you just did then, but also through song. When you're teaching permaculture, find that you focus a lot on trying to share the stories, or is it how do you weave your pattern of?
Look, I use both, and for me, it's important that the stories relate to the subject matter. Yes. And I meet a lot of students that do courses with people who are highly traveled, and they get all these amazing stories, but they come away knowing nothing
without the structure of the knowledge. Yeah.
And so for me, it's important that the story is supporting the learning. And that was something that Bill was really strong on. And I really value his mentorship in my early years. He's a brilliant storyteller. And as he sort of got older and his brain cells started to atrophy, he would just sort of whatever story came into his head. But in his prime as a teacher, and that was one of the things he always impressed on me. Don't just leave people with a concept. Give them a concrete example. And the best way to do that is through story.
What other things did you find inspiration from Bill? You spent a lot of time teaching with him, obviously, and had a long relationship with him.
Yeah, he was a wonderful mentor and friend. And it was really interesting, the PDC in India, how he adapted the course to the local plants, the local climate, the local context. And look at his compassion. his compassion was, really, really inspiring. I'm sort of, feeling a bit emotional at the moment. I remember, like our driver, because most people, they just don't bother with the driver, in India, they're just the driver. But he got to know his name and the name of all his kids and about his family and all this stuff. And he built relationships with the lowest of the low, with the cooks, with the cleaners, with the car drivers and so forth. He actually wrote a poem while we were there called The Invisible People. He was an incredibly compassionate man. And I think a lot of people didn't really see that side of Bill. I mean, he couldn't suffer fools well. And so some of his appalling behaviour just comes from people coming up and asking him really stupid questions. And okay, they sort of say in teacher training and stuff, there's no such thing as a stupid question. Well, yes, there is. You ask a stupid question, you might get a pretty weird answer. And the answer you get is as good as the question you ask. The same with research. Whenever I look at research and it sort of doesn't quite ring true, I go, well, what were they asking? What were they looking for? But no, a lot of gems from Bill. Of course, when I was based in Sydney, that was his stopping point whenever he came back from teaching overseas. And he'd usually stay with us for 4 or 5 days while he was printing his photographs. So the old days of, analog photos. He was writing the designer's manual at the time. So, there's sort of pages of the manual I'll open up and I go, oh, yes, I remember that. We were raving about that until 2 a.m. in the morning after we had this beautiful dinner down at the Turkish restaurant in Newtown. And
so the process of him writing it was as he was going out to different places and collecting stories, and he'd bring it back and just weave it into this. Is that
actually, how it got started and designed? Andrew Jeeves was a really important part of the original structure of that. It was one of the things he put me onto as New Scientist, because back then, you couldn't Google stuff and you had to, get information in paper format. And he used to, he subscribed to New Scientist because that's where you sort of got, a lot of your updates. Anywhere that he saw information or good stuff, he'd just tear it out. And he had all these tea chests full of pieces of paper of notes and observations of articles and stuff that he'd sort of chucked in there. Andrew Jeeves decided they should organise all this information. And so they started to organise it into themes. And those themes then sort of became the chapters of the designer's manual. Bill sort of went through his stuff and did further research. I got sort of fascinating insights, like when he was doing the chapter on trees, he could not find a good source of information about the thermals that rise from, forests and forest edges and so on. So he decided he'd cast his net a little wider. Who actually uses that knowledge? Hang gliders. So then he delved into hang gliding journals, found all this information about how you get these thermal spirals coming out of the edge of a forest and certain aspects of the topography. And I think he's, such a brilliant mind, the way he actually cast his net so wide to find the gems that connected the dots to create a whole theory. There was a lot of kickback when the manual came out from many parts of the science community. But what I find fascinating is that most of the stuff they were criticising that Bill actually, connected the dots on, in the meantime has been validated scientifically.
What were some of those things that got the kickback? Do you remember? What were people?
Oh, especially on the forest chapter. Oh. And how forests create rain. Yeah. And so it wasn't until the 90s when they isolated the isotopes of, the core of raindrops, and they could identify whether they were from forest origin, whether they're from ocean origin. And then they managed to fine-tune it even more, and they could identify even what forest. Mm-hmm. And when I was in Brazil, that was, I think that was 2008, there's a big research centre there in Manaus. They had been tracking the Amazon water, because it was amazing, flying into Manaus. I've never seen such massive thunderhead clouds. And I just looked out the window and I just went, wow, this is all about clouds and rain and water. It's not just a river. It's not just a forest. This is a major, sort of source of atmospheric moisture. And anyway, they tracked through these, analysing the nuclei of raindrops. Amazon water is actually falling a certain percentage, I can't remember the percent, but a certain percentage of the rain that falls in Sweden comes from the Amazon. I mean, it just creates this massive river in the sky that, circulates the planet, and just really fascinating stuff.
Yeah. It's amazing. It's an amazing book. And so were you involved in when the first PDCs emerged out of that book, and how did those courses kind of start? Just as just want to touch base with that, because I hear, people saying, oh, well, the course comes out of the book.
No, the course came first. The course came first, and there's, before the book was published, the Permaculture Institute published a course curriculum guide. That was put together by Rennie Slay, Andrew Jeeves, Bill, and a couple of other people. And it actually includes stuff that's not in the book, which I still include in my PDCs, like seed saving, and not just doing things by climate, but by zone, sort of home gardens and orchard and things. And so within those different themes, we'll look at the variations in different climates. But I actually organised the launch of that book in 1988 at our Australian Permaculture Convergence down at Yarrahapini. And he held the book up and he said, this book is for people who have done a PDC. The PDC prepares you to read and use this book. This book is the culmination of the first 10 years of permaculture experimentation and practice around the world. It is a body of knowledge which is continually growing and expanding, and you are all a part of that process.
Beautiful.
Nothing was said about it being the curriculum.
Yeah.
A textbook is not a curriculum. A curriculum is an educator. A curriculum is a very different thing to a textbook. Yeah. And I think it's sad when people just teach a chapter a day.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, it just doesn't really work. And there's too much important stuff that gets missed out.
Yeah. And how have you evolved permaculture over the years with new ideas and things that are coming along? So do you find that you just keep adapting and changing and adding and bringing, or like obviously there's a core thread, but different things that you weave in that you do now that you never did before?
Yeah, I mean, you come up with little sort of brainwaves for activities, constantly updating with current earth science and regenerative ag science and soil food web, and there's just so much amazing information that's coming out now, and it's sort of validating a lot of those early premises of permaculture thinking. There's also the whole invisible structures, and I sort of did some serious changes to that part of the course fairly early on in the piece, because I was involved in getting the Earth Bank Society happening in Sydney after IPC1, and sat down with the guys there and said, well, look, how can we make this really meaningful, in terms of economics and legal structures? Because with legal structures, I mean, Bill was infatuated with trusts, and that was pretty much as far as it went. So we sat down, we said, well, look, what would be a permaculture design approach to selecting an appropriate legal structure? Okay, what are the functions of legal structures? What kind of activities do we use them for? What are the options? How do they apply? In which contexts do they apply? We actually, did some major revisions, in a way, of what we taught and how we taught it. And I mean, I touched base with Bill on all of those things. He didn't change his teaching. He had his style and his message, but he was very supportive. And he went, well, that's a really interesting, because, we cover associations and, non-profit companies, for-profit companies, cooperatives, trusts, the full menu, but what and where and how they're appropriate, and just some basic things on governance. And I think that's so important. So there's things like that I've changed. And Ro in her book actually attributes that formula to Bill, but no, I had introduced some of these changes before she did her PDC with me in 1987. I should sit down and have a chat with her one day and thank her for taking so much of my stuff forward.
I think that's really interesting too. I was going to ask you about, the manual that, that Bill held up and saying that this is the 10 years culmination, and all of the things that have gone since then. Like, what is it that we need to bring forward as, like the 2023 or 2024? Yeah. Do you think there's a space for having the document that's the up-to-date one, or is it something that has gone more into just, it's myceliated so much and it's just out there in the world in all the multiplicity of forms?
You'd have to make, sort of 8 volumes of that size to really bring it up to date. And it's just overwhelmed. And I mean, we're so privileged in living in this age of electronic communications and having so much amazing information at our fingertips. I'm constantly sort of updating, I suppose, not so much my PDC handbook notes, but each course or every year or so I will update my PowerPoints, the content that I deliver. Yeah. And it's too much to sort of just try and rewrite my handbook every time. Yeah. And so with the PowerPoints, and the beauty of that is you can bring in visual, and I don't have death by PowerPoints, which are just reading words off screens. That's shocking. You can explain something and you can draw scratches on a chalkboard until the cows come home and they won't get it, but show them a photo. Yeah. And they go, yeah. It's really important. And, providing links in there for people to take it further. So I give my students, a PDF of the PowerPoint so that they can follow that through and refresh the information. And, of course, with education, and Bill was a classic old school, chalk and talk. And look, there is a place for that. There is a place for that, and really good, sort of deep thought presentations that challenge your thinking and take you a quantum leap further. But it's also important to break that up with, your more experiential and fun stuff, sort of group work, with water. We like to start the sessions on water in permaculture, just getting people thinking about water on planet Earth. So I have a litre jug of water that represents all the water of planet Earth. And 3% of that, 1 tablespoon, is fresh water. And then we have little lines going out from the centre, and there's, one for available groundwater, unavailable groundwater, rivers, soil and forests, atmosphere, lakes and ponds, etc., etc. And then they get a set of cards that have got percentages on them, and they've got to work out which percentage belongs to which source of fresh water. Yeah. Look, it's an activity. It takes 10 minutes, but they come away from that sort of with a whole new perspective on what a precious, incredibly precious and limited resource water is. And so that sort of just brings them into a space where they come into learning about water collection and harvest and all that sort of stuff with a really deep appreciation.
Yeah, I think, any way that you can deepen that engagement. But I also agree with you too that there is a place for a monologue. There is a space for a conversation. There is a space for the embodiment. Like, there's a space for all of those things, and I think that helps us to develop that understanding. And I love that idea too, that when you're an educator you could be so creative, like you were saying, I come up with different activities. And that's kind of the fun about it, isn't it too? To come up with different ways of thinking, well, I'm in this group, in this culture, in this place, this climate, what's going to make sense and help it to land. And
or you notice the energy levels getting a little low, and you're talking about ecology and all these big concepts, and then and principles and ecology. And one day I had this group that was really struggling, and we sort of got to everything gardens, and I just saw all these really quizzical looks. I says, okay, let's go outside and make an elephant's garden. Because I'd seen this great documentary a couple of months beforehand about how elephants are, sort of terraformers, and how they actually change their environment, and they've got their mother trees that they visit, and then as they go from mother tree to mother tree, of course they're pooping the seeds out, and so they're creating these corridor forests, and they also will knock down trees and create clearings, and then in the wet season they'll wallow and create ponds. And so we did this whole fun little skit where some people are trees and others are elephants, and we create an elephant's garden, and we could make a pond, and then we've got some little gazelles that come down that the elephants are looking at. Oh yeah, look at the legs on that gazelle. Look, it's great, and they just get it. They just really get it, and it's only 10 minutes out of the classroom.
Yeah.
And then they come back in really fresh and ready to take in more information, and just sort of breaking things up.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned about everything gardens and as one of the principles, and I know that there's the Mollisonian principles and there's the Holmgren principles, and then there's other, how do you present the principles of permaculture?
Look, we start off with David's, because the cards are really handy. And it's only 12. We introduce them, and then we get them in groups with a cluster of cards to come up with some examples, so that they're then sort of talking about them and discussing them. I have a follow-up session where we look at some of Bill's golden ones that sort of aren't quite in there with David's, and especially the attitudinal principles. And the 3 guiding principles and examples of how they work, and sort of just leads perfectly into looking at the ecological basis of permaculture and some of the key concepts there.
Yeah. How have you approached shifting the consciousness of permaculture being something that we just do in our backyards, and like for us, a me thing to a we thing? Like, I know that you've done a lot of different work on this space, but I wonder if you could just talk about that a bit more, about how the social permaculture, I guess, as it's called now, how that shows up for you.
Yeah, look, it's really important, that shift from the me to the we thinking. I think it's sort of even more critical now than it was a few years ago. Sadly, after the first COVID lockdown, everybody just withdrew into the me space, whereas initially there was an amazing outreach of we-ness, and it was just really sad to see that contraction. And of course, the conspiracy rabbit holes didn't help. And sadly, I've lost some good friends and even family through that process. I mean, a lot of it's through, examples. The last section of the course, because I break the course into 3 major parts. The first part is sort of like the introduction to permaculture ethics principles, sort of patterns in nature, and the basic ecology, and I suppose earth science literacy. And then we go into the design part of the course with the design methodology, and then through the different systems and zones and special themes. The last section of the course is the social permaculture and the invisible structures. Because then people have sort of got all the stuff that they want for me. Then, bioregional thinking and stuff just blows them apart. They sort of go, wow. Oh, and it's lovely also living in a village that is practicing so much of what is being taught. It's been an absolute privilege to be living here in Nimbin, and part of that process over the years of community initiatives and consultation and community empowerment. And during our initial introduction, I go, well, my profession's got nothing at all to do with permaculture. I'm a social worker. And then at the end of the course, I go, wow, I thought being a social worker had nothing to do with permaculture, but yes, I can't wait to get back to work, and I've got all these fantastic tools and
Yeah, it's kind of like a lens, isn't it? I see that you can apply to wherever you go, and you just start to see through these. Yeah. It's a paradigm shift. It's a way of seeing and knowing. I wanted to ask you too. So you talked a lot about teaching at your place there where you are at Djanbung Gardens, and you also teach about going and teaching overseas. What are some of your key messages to people about, you hear people saying, oh yeah, I'd like to go and teach overseas. What would be your key thing that you would say to them?
Don't go in as a permaculture savior. We're not perma-missionaries, okay? And you're going in to learn as much as you give. It's a two-way process. So important to recognise, what exists and the strengths and the resources of a place that, you're actually making it relative, getting contributions from them about their traditional systems. It was interesting. I had a young lady once came here to Wolf, and she'd done her PDC with someone else a couple of years prior, and she just returned from India, and she'd gone over to India thinking she was going to do all this amazing permaculture stuff and save people. Anyway, she said, I was so disappointed because you can't do permaculture in India. You can't do it at all. And I went, oh, why is that? She said, well, people don't live in the middle of their farms, so you can't do zonation, so you can't do permaculture. So when people turn things into dogmas, you've got to go back to the principle. What is the principle behind zonation? It's about proximity and access. So even in a lot of Europe, you've got your little farming hamlets, and the houses are all clustered together. And so you've got the zone 1 of your individual homes. The village or the hamlet itself is like a zone 2 because, the pigs and the chickens are running everywhere, and there'll be, fruit trees and stuff. And then, zone 3 is your windbreaks and your more intensive production systems with the farm. And then your zone 4 is your production forestry, and your zone 5 is your zone 5. It's sort of reframing things in a way that makes sense. Otherwise people go, oh, it doesn't work here. One of my favourite things that I harp on is that there's only one dogma in permaculture, and that is there are no dogmas. If you're getting stuck on dogmas, you just got to take a step back. What are the principles behind this? And actually, it was a really good discipline for me when we started to develop the accredited permaculture training and sort of getting into the vet way of thinking. There's a lot of focus on things in permaculture water systems. Oh, well, you've got to do about swales, and you've got to do about this and that. I said, well, no, why are we using swales? What is the principle? What is the purpose? What is the function that can support? Well, it's about managing water. It's flowing it, spreading it, sinking it. And swales are just one of many, many ways that we can do that. People are quite shocked to find out that not all sites are suitable for swales. Not all soil types are suitable for swales. Some of the hills around here that have got sort of bedrock and highly porous soils, you put in swales on those slopes and you're just going to get landslips like we had last year with the mega flood. And it's also showing that there's many ways to achieve things. So people sort of just don't leave thinking, how can it be a permaculture? It doesn't have a swale, or it doesn't have a herb spiral, or it doesn't have a mandala garden.
Like you're saying, the thinking of the backstory, the principles, the why, and how to build the best possible relationship between the elements in the site itself and the people who are there as part of it. And it's that relationality that's so important.
The techniques are the last thing you choose.
Yeah.
And that will vary with the site and the scale of operation and the climate and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you then too, because, this is a question, an age-old question in permaculture, and it relates to what we just talked about. So, you come and do your 2-week course, and then you think, okay, I've got it. Now I want to go and teach overseas, but you haven't had that depth of practice, I guess, because it is a practice, consistent. Like you and I are always continuously learning. Whenever we see something, it adds to our, new dimensions. So what are the pathways for people to come out of course and then practice enough so that they can become an educator, can be useful contributors and mentors to other people? What do you recommend to people on that?
Get experience. I mean, Bill used to say what we need are the best practitioners to go to the third world, not the beginners, because there's very little room for failure.
Yeah.
They don't have social security nets to pick them up if they lose everything, if their crop fails or whatever. I've had people spend, long periods of time here at Djanbung, just really diving deeper and getting practical knowledge. On Lachlan, before he went to East Timor, he came and lived here at Djanbung Gardens for 9 months. Because, he'd never worked with tropical, subtropical vegetables down in Adelaide. You just don't grow cassava and taro, and it's a nice sort of in-between climate where we've got, half the year is pretty much tropical and the other half the year is warm temperate. Yeah, he spent, 9 months here doing advanced courses and just really being involved in the gardens and making good use of our library and doing lots of research and visiting other, permaculture farms and properties around. You're better off going as an assistant with somebody that knows their stuff.
Yeah.
And I just really treasure those first 2 trips in India with Bill.
Yeah.
And he's just such an amazing observer. And he would, see things that I, just hadn't really noticed. And I go, wow. And so you just become a far more keen observer. And it's really important to get, your skills up.
And you're still teaching overseas, aren't you?
I'll be going to Taiwan in September to do teacher training and a course on sort of community building. I mean, since COVID, I haven't done any overseas teaching, or I think my last OS course was 2018. We've taught these courses there. Each course had over 40 participants. We also, the last time I was there, we did a teacher training course. Yeah. Many of those graduates are just really doing amazing stuff in their own areas. Look, you can't babysit people forever. No. I told the guys when I taught the first course in Taiwan, I says, look, I might teach one, I might come back for another one. But I really want to see you guys teaching your own course and translating it into Chinese. And has just done an amazing job over there. Helped set up Permaculture Institute and Network. She got Rosemary Morrow's Earth Users Guide to Permaculture translated into Chinese, published some of their own books, translated Holmgren's Principles and Pathways. One of my graduates from mainland China translated The Outdoor Classroom.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so that's available for, school teachers. And that's what's really important is, getting things in language. Yeah. That's often the biggest barrier. So when I'm in a place, initially I really recommend that people start translating material so that there's that backup there for people to dive deeper and go further. And otherwise it's just too Anglo-centric.
Yeah. How do you manage with like book rights and all of that? Is that something that the publishers organise, or is there just...
Yeah, I tell them to get in touch with the publisher or the author, and where I've been involved, I always insist on that.
Fantastic. Yeah. Oh, it's great. Yeah. Well, what do you hope is where permaculture will continue to move towards? I mean, the issues that we're facing in the world are just continuing to grow on a daily basis. And yet I feel like there's something really essential in what permaculture has to offer. How can we get it out further and faster and deeper? And
there's a lot of people putting a lot of great material out online, and videos like Andrew Millicent's videos are great. And it's interesting that a lot of the really good free stuff, they're excellent permaculturalists that are being employed by universities. And so they've got university funding and resources behind them, and it makes it hard for paying as we go to compete. But I also see that, well, they're resources that I don't have to create. In terms of Australia, we really need to start promoting the permaculture lower certificates in the high school system, Certificate 1 and Certificate 2 in permaculture. They're great clusters of units that can be done there, and pathway for teaching those has been simplified. We really need to start to get trainers up to scratch with the accredited training and get it out there and get it into the TAFEs and places like that. Just empowering people locally and getting involved in community initiatives and community garden spaces. And I mean, there's just so many opportunities to reach out to people. And a lot of people are really hungry for that information. You know, it can be a struggle sometimes making ends meet. You've just got to be really creative in that space. Look at what resources you have and what the needs are around you. And even if you just do things that, you know, you offer, and there's some short workshops that I'll offer, and people, you know, if they make a donation, and just events to bring people together. So important to have events of conviviality, where people can come together with music and dance and art and theatre, underpin that with good ecology, or in a space where they can see, well, you know, there are solutions. Once you've got those rich community connections, then it's a lot easier for people to action things.
Yeah. And once you start to enjoy and make friends and have fun together, the other stuff becomes simple. If you go first with the idea of let's do a permaculture project, and you don't have the relationships, it can be an uphill battle, I find. You know, starting small, you know, use what you have. And do what you can, you know. It's very simple.
And amazing what can come out of that.
I did want to just backtrack a little bit, because you were talking about take the certificates into the schools, and you mentioned that it's been simplified now for people to do it. I wonder whether you could just describe what is the pathway for people to actually become a certified teacher of the accredited permaculture programs in Australia.
I mean, the key thing is that you still need the TAE Cert 4, because it is vocational training, and you've got to understand that system. And it's totally different to like a DipEd or whatever. Now, there's a group in Permaculture Australia, the Permaculture Australia Educators Group. They are looking at creating a TAE Cert 4 for permaculturalists. And actually, Linda Woodrow is spearheading that, because she taught the TAE for many years in Lismore. But you can teach those lower certificates with a PDC. The important thing is that you've had experience. And a lot of high school education is moving more into vet. And then, of course, you know, the Certificate 3 is brilliant for people that really want to practice. The Certificate 3 embodies a lot of the practical applied skills that you come out of a PDC going, oh, I wish I knew how to do this. I think it's sort of sad that it's not been promoted seriously by the permaculture community, because, I think it's an absolute treasure and a gem, and it really needs to be promoted, and we need to start, lobbying TAFEs and training organisations, even community colleges that are RTOs. Yeah.
And where do you see the state of the diploma, permaculture diploma these days?
Well, there's two diplomas. There's the unofficial one and there's the accredited one. I don't think anybody's actually offering the accredited diploma. There's some wonderful units in there, and it is actually sort of quite high level. For 11 years, we offered the Certificate 3, 4 and diploma here at Djanbung. What my diploma graduates have actually done with that knowledge and skills, just really heartwarming.
Yeah.
It's mind-blowing.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Robyn. It's been an absolute delight to catch up with you and to really tap into there's so many other things that we didn't talk about, like the Ecovillage that you created and, running the Permaculture
we can do that another day.
So many things that you've been initiated and pioneering in permaculture. Just want to say an enormous thank you, and for all the inspiration that I came and spent many courses down with you too, and have come away inspired and opened up my world to what the possibilities are in permaculture, and have dedicated my life to permaculture as well. It's what I do every day, wake up and, and also live in an eco-village. So thank you for your inspiration.
Thank you, Morag. It's been lovely sharing with you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Sense Making the Changing World, the podcast of the Permaculture Education Institute. Check out the show notes below to find the links to Robyn Francis's work. Also, too, this is where you'll find details of all of our permaculture courses, our permaculture YouTube, blog, and free masterclasses and permaculture film clubs. Make sure you signed up too to hear all of the news and updates. And come and join us at the Permaculture Education Institute to learn practical skills for designing and teaching permaculture and making a good livelihood while living a permaculture-inspired, one planet way of life. Take care, everyone. See you soon.